It's December 14th, 1911, when 5 polar explorers plant the Norwegian flag on the geographic South Pole. They are the first humans to reach this harsh, unforgiving terrain. Ironically, their original goal was to conquer the opposite end of the Earth. Their leader, Roald Amundsen, would go down in history as one of the greatest polar explorers and a national hero. Just 5 weeks later, another expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott arrives at the same spot, only to discover they had been beaten in the race to the South Pole. A race that would tragically cost them their lives. But what led to their dramatic fate, and how did the Norwegians succeed in reaching the South Pole first? The early 20th century marked the zenith of polar exploration, with numerous expeditions venturing into the Arctic and Antarctic, driven by an intense race to claim the poles. Both Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott shared this ambitious goal, to be the first to conquer one of Earth's extremities. And while Scott set his sights on the South Pole, Amundsen initially aimed to achieve this feat at the North Pole. However, Amundsen's plan was appended by Robert Peary and Frederick Cook, who claimed to have reached the North Pole first. Subsequently, informing only a handful of his change in plans, Amundsen redirected his ambitions to the Southern Hemisphere. This shift went unnoticed until his ship unexpectedly docked in Madeira, having initially set out for the North Pole. At this point, Amundsen decided to inform his crew and the public about his true plan to conquer the South Pole. And as they resumed the journey southward, news of Amundsen's intentions reached his British opponent, who realized he was now in a race to the South Pole. Robert Falcon Scott had attempted to reach the South Pole years earlier, but was forced to turn back due to harsh weather conditions and illness. Despite this setback, Scott remained determined to secure this achievement for the British Empire. He raised funds and prepared a scientific program for researching the Antarctic region. However, the news of Amundsen's plans was not a complete disaster for Scott, as he was already on his way to Antarctica. In fact, Scott reached his destination at Ross Island 10 days before Amundsen and his team arrived at the Bay of Wales. So, what went so awfully wrong for the well-prepared Scott, which went right for Amundsen? Amundsen held a clear advantage from the start, having established his base at the Bay of Wales, which was 60 miles closer to the pole compared to Scott's base at Cape Evans. He chose an easier yet less known route that led his party through a steeper but significantly shorter ascent to the polar plateau. This strategic choice meant that his team spent less time exposed to the extreme high altitude cold. Conversely, Scott opted for a previously known route involving a long, gradual climb to the polar plateau. Crucially, his team set out for the South Pole much later than Amundsen's, a delay that proved fatal. Scott's expedition was also plagued by a series of grave errors in planning and preparation. Their provisions were insufficient for their needs, and they were inadequately equipped and overly reliant on motor sledges, which failed under the harsh Antarctic conditions. Moreover, Scott's team lacked experience in polar conditions. They brought skis, but were too inexperienced to use them effectively, opting instead to walk to the South Pole. The team also relied on ponies for hauling, which are poorly suited for icy and snowy conditions, especially without snowshoes. Although they had sled dogs, the team failed to utilize or care for them properly, resulting in the animals passing. Ultimately, the men were forced to haul their own supplies, significantly slowing their progress. On the other hand, Roald Amundsen was a seasoned polar explorer. In addition to his extensive experience in polar conditions, he had spent time living with the Inuit, learning invaluable skills, including how to effectively manage sled dogs and the importance of appropriate cold weather gear. He was also extremely pragmatic, choosing to bring 97 Greenland dogs on his journey. This breed is known for its robustness and strength, ideal for enduring extreme weather conditions. Amundsen's strategy involved using many of the dogs for hauling supplies early in the expedition and as a food source for both the expedition team and the remaining dogs later on. Ultimately, 11 dogs survived the journey to the South Pole, with 3 returning to Norway as celebrated heroes. In addition to utilizing sled dogs, Amundsen opted for Inuit-style clothing made entirely from furs, which provided superior insulation compared to the woolen garments typically worn by European explorers. His team's proficiency in skiing also significantly enhanced their mobility, allowing them to move swiftly across the Antarctic landscape. And after overcoming initial setbacks, they successfully reached their destination 5 weeks before Scott's party. When Scott and his men arrived at the South Pole, they were already in dire condition due to malnutrition. Discovering that they were not the first to arrive must have been devastating. Compounding their disappointment, they found Amundsen's camp and equipment which he had left behind, along with a letter addressed to Scott. In it, Amundsen requested that Scott deliver the letter to the King of Norway as proof of his prior arrival. After a day's rest, the British party set off to return to their base, a destination they were never meant to reach. While all 5 members of Amundsen's party safely returned to their base, Scott and his men were surprised by a blizzard and perished in the cold of Antarctica. Of cold, hunger and exhaustion, a mere 11 miles from a supply depot stocked with fuel and food that could have saved them. 8 months later, when their bodies were discovered, the letter from Amundsen was found with Scott's remains, showing his unyielding dedication despite the tragedy. Along with it, there was a farewell letter from Scott to the public, where he described the events of the doomed expedition, knowing they would not survive. With hindsight, it might seem that Scott's venture was doomed from the start, but both luck and inherent advantages and disadvantages of each team played significant roles. The bravery of Scott and his team cannot be disputed, and Scott went down in history as one of Britain's national heroes. Although he did not sabotage Scott's mission or hinder his progress directly, Amundsen's secretive change of plans at the start of the race was seen by some as unsporting. Nevertheless, being the first man at the South Pole brought Amundsen the fame needed to secure funding for further polar explorations by ship and plane. Between expeditions, he traveled and gave lectures to share his experience and raise public interest, until at the age of 55, he embarked on his final mission. There, one of the greatest polar explorers perished as he had lived, on an Arctic expedition near the North Pole, this time attempting to rescue a fellow explorer and colleague who had become his new opponent.